This is lecture 11.5 for Psych 440, Myths and Facts about Sexual Harassment. And as just stated there in the title, our main objectives in this lecture are to distinguish some of the facts and myths about sexual harassment. In the last lecture, we talked quite a bit about the legal perspective of sexual harassment. In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the psychological research that's been conducted on sexual harassment and some of the things that we know from a psychological and a scientific perspective. One of the questions that people very often start with is, how big a deal is this really? How common is sexual harassment? Is this just, a few isolated cases that just get a lot of attention, or is it really something that is a common part of the working experience? Well, depending on how you ask and how you count, there are some estimates that have claimed that overall, if you count all types of sexual harassment across the working lifetime, as many as 50% of women in the U.S. will experience some form of sexual harassment over the course of their working careers. If you think that number sounds very wildly inflated, very speculative, some of the studies that go into that estimate, looking at retrospective reports, has this ever happened to you? In one study in the U.S. military, 78% of women and 38% of men reported that they had experienced at least one or at least a few behaviors that do fit the definition of sexual harassment. Now, of course, there are some it depends in here. One thing that we know from the research is that many people will say, if you just ask, has anyone ever done this with you? Have you ever experienced this in the workplace? Many people will say, yes, they've experienced behaviors that researchers would categorize as sexual harassment, but if you ask those same people, have you ever been sexually harassed? They say no. One of the explanations for this is that sexual harassment is a very controversial, it's a very stigmatizing thing to experience. Many people don't want to think of themselves as harassment victims. There is some evidence to show that people who say they've experienced sexual harassment are perceived more negatively and stigmatized by other people. So the labeling phenomenon has received a great deal of research attention. Not everybody who has experienced behaviors we'd call sexual harassment is willing to call those behaviors sexual harassment. So in the research world, we very often work with what we call the psychological definition of sexual harassment. The psychological definition of sexual harassment is a set of fairly well agreed upon behaviors that can be considered harassing, regardless of whether the person experiencing them wants to call it harassment or not. Now, a very common question is, who does the harassing? We do find, in general, women are most likely to be harassed by men, but some of the other stereotypes about sexual harassment don't necessarily hold up. When we picture sexual harassment, we tend to picture that quid pro quo scenario that we talked about in the last lecture, where an older male supervisor offers job-related benefits to a younger female employee if she will give him sexual favors. Well, one study that examined people's reports of sexual harassment found that only about a third of the harassers were supervisors. There were almost as many co-workers engaging in harassment as supervisors, and there have been some studies that show quite a bit of sexual harassment coming from customers or clients or other people outside the organization. There was a study of police officers in the UK that found that they most commonly experienced sexual harassment from members of the public. It still impacts their job, but it's much more complicated because the organization, of course, can't directly control the behavior of its customers or of the public in general. Research trying to predict who will harass, there's been quite a bit of it. Not all of it gets very far. We don't find very large, substantial correlations between demographic characteristics and harassing behavior, but there is a measure out there called the Likelihood to Sexually Harass Scale. Now, this scale does not just ask people, so how likely do you think you are to sexually harass other people? Instead, what it does is it presents a bunch of workplace scenarios and then asks, if you were the employee in this scenario, what would you do next? And one of the 4 options after each scenario is a behavior that could be considered sexual harassment. So basically it's asking it's not necessarily transparent. If you completed this measure, you wouldn't necessarily know, unless you were looking, that it was assessing someone's interest in sexual harassment behavior. Scores on this test are related to another measure called rape myth acceptance, which is belief of common misperceptions about rape. Things like, if a woman is wearing very revealing clothing, she probably secretly wants to be raped. People who tend to endorse those beliefs also tend to score high on the likelihood to sexually harass scale. And interestingly enough, although this is a very indirect measure, and it's one that if you looked at it, you wouldn't really think it would work, there have been a couple of studies that found that people's scores on this measure did predict the degree to which people would engage in inappropriate behavior with a female confederate in lab studies. So we don't know much about the characteristics of people who are likely to harass. We certainly couldn't use this scale as a selection test and say we're going to screen out people who are likely to sexually harass. It doesn't have that kind of high-quality validity evidence yet, but we are starting to kind of build a picture that it is a predictable trait, or a reasonably predictable disposition that people carry around with them. For starting, we talked about the question of who harasses, then the next important question is who is likely to be harassed? Question over to the right, are men sexually harassed? And the answer to that question is, overall, yes. Yes, they are. And not only by women, or not only by gay men. What we find from the research is that men do report sexual harassment. If you think back to a couple of slides ago, in the military, 38% of men in one study reported exposure to some sexually harassing behavior. But it seems that what men experience as sexual harassment is a little bit different from what women experience as sexual harassment. In particular, the thing that's a little bit surprising, when men report sexual harassment, it is actually most often by heterosexual men. So it's not so much about unwanted sexual attention. Quid pro quo harassment of men is very, very rare. But when men describe sexual harassment experiences, they talk about times when they were harassed for not being masculine enough or not conforming to gender expectations. So the stereotype, or the thing that we might picture of a man being sexually harassed by a gay man who is romantically interested in him is actually very far from the norm. That's relatively rare in the studies that are out there. Instead, what we find are men experiencing sexual harassment for not conforming enough to societal male gender norms. For both women, there are some pretty good studies documenting the consequences of sexual harassment. Employees who experience sexual harassment tend to have negative mental and physical health outcomes. In fact, in some studies, they've shown a higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder among people who have been substantially sexually harassed. So we're not talking about mild discomfort here. We're talking about things like persistent chronic headaches, clinical levels of anxiety and depression, not necessarily in every case, but in enough cases to say that this can be something that we should take seriously. Employees who are sexually harassed tend to show poorer job performance and low job satisfaction because, if you think back to that first legal definition, they are working under different conditions. They are working under more stressful conditions than people who are not being sexually harassed. And we also find that it's not only the most extreme and egregious cases of sexual harassment. Even fairly mild or low-level sexual harassment behaviors sustained over time, or kind of moderate-level sexual harassment behaviors, show these same kinds of negative patterns and consequences. There are also consequences for the organization. If your employees who are sexually harassed are experiencing poorer job performance, poorer job satisfaction, they are less productive and they turn over more. Where this gets really problematic is that some research has documented that there are spillover effects to the rest of the work group. So if one person in a work group is experiencing sexual harassment and the rest of the work group perceives that nothing is being done about that harassment, even the people in the group who are not being harassed themselves have lower satisfaction. They have higher turnover intentions, and the group as a whole is a little bit less productive. So it's not just the immediate victims of harassment who are affected. And then, of course, a major concern for organizations, tying back to the last lecture, is that the organization can be legally liable. These kinds of cases can be very expensive if you lose. Even if the organization is found not liable for the harassment, there's still a great deal of negative publicity, a great deal of expense involved in defending against these charges. To kind of wrap up here, I want to bring up a handful of legal facts, and these come straight from the EEOC's website. Things that people often don't know or aren't aware of about what is and isn't sexual harassment. As we said a little bit ago, either the victim or the harasser can be male, female, transgender. Harassment is not exclusively something that happens from men to women. It doesn't have to be an opposite sex interaction. Women have been known to sexually harass other women. Men have been known to sexually harass other men. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with romantic attraction or sexual desire. Very often, sexual harassment is about enforcing conformity to gender norms, and that enforcement can come from people of any gender. Again, as we said a little while ago, the harasser can be anyone. It doesn't necessarily have to be the supervisor or a person in a position of power. Although that does happen often, it's not the majority of sexual harassment incidents. And so we need to not only pay attention to situations where there's a power differential. Because of those findings about spillover and negative impacts even on people who aren't direct victims, you don't have to be the direct victim to make a claim about sexual harassment. If you are a person in the work group who is affected by this conduct, if you see a sexual harassment situation going on and it's affecting your work performance or your conditions of employment, you have legal standing to make a claim of sexual harassment. And again, as I think we talked about in the last lecture, the harm from sexual harassment doesn't have to be direct and tangible. Even if someone does not lose or quit a job, even if they're not fired or demoted as a result of the harassment, those psychological consequences are also considered important. The behavior is unacceptable regardless of what the outcomes look like for the victim. If this is something that's interesting, finally, the last critical piece about sexual harassment is that a defining element of sexual harassment is that the conduct must be unwelcome. So if you think back to that very first example in the previous lecture, is asking a coworker out on a date sexual harassment? If you ask a coworker for a date and the coworker says, "Sure, that sounds great," that's not unwelcome conduct and it's not harassment. If you persist in asking that coworker for a date after the coworker has said no, then they've made clear that your conduct is unwelcome and you've persisted in it and created this pattern of behavior. So most of these points, you'll notice, really broaden what we think about as harassment. This does set a limit. The conduct must be an unwelcome. Sexual or romantic interactions between between consenting adults in the same workplace are not necessarily sexual harassment. They may or may not be acceptable under company policy, but that's not the same thing. They wouldn't rise to the level of harassment. And then finally, because this is such a prevalent thing, when we talk about this in a face-to-face class, it's not uncommon to have students say, wow, I've had those experiences, or I know someone who's having those experiences. And so I want to step a little bit out of the factual educator role here and just encourage you to be aware if this is something that you've experienced. You have some rights. It's not necessarily okay. One of the first things that's recommended if you're experiencing harassment, if it's not coming from your boss, tell your boss. If the harassment is coming from your boss or you have good reasons for not telling your boss, tell someone else in the organization that you trust. Organizations, for the most part, are aware of their responsibility to prevent and correct harassment. You want to give them an opportunity to do so. And because of the very well-documented psychological and health impacts of sexual harassment, if this is something that's happened to you, I would encourage you to think about seeking help. There are many excellent counselors who are knowledgeable about these situations, who can help to minimize the harm, whether you think it's something you want to go on and file a legal claim about, whether it's something that the organization settles or doesn't settle. The data on the mental health impacts of harassment is real, and it can be very significant. So if this resonates with you, if this is something that sparks some curiosity in you, I would encourage you to check out some resources, seek some help. The EEOC site has a lot of really good information, and there's some very excellent other resources out there for people who've experienced sexual harassment. Coming up next, at the beginning of the next module, is Exam 3. Exam 3 will cover selection and employment law. And then after Exam 3, the next topic we'll move on to will be training in organizations.